especially to Liz for inviting me here. I'm afraid I was supposed to be in conversation with Jana, and we had a slightly different plan, but I heard late last night that she's not well, so I have fallen back on another presentation I did this week in Dublin, and I hope that's going to be okay for this context. So I'm just going to talk through some of the projects we've done with the showroom, and Liz was interested in how we worked in a very collaborative way in relation to diverse communities, some very local to the showroom. So I've just shown, I find it easier to explain that through examples, so I've kind of pulled out a few examples. But to put that in context, the showroom was founded in 1983. I've just met Yasha, who had a show there in 86, was it? Yeah. So it has a long history, and I think, I don't know how familiar everyone here is with it, but it has very much been centred on commissioning artists to produce new work. We moved to this building, so the showroom was in Bethnal Green in East London, and we moved, I initiated this move actually, we moved there in 2009, and now the showroom is situated in a neighbourhood called Church Street, which is just off Edgware Road. Actually, I haven't done that here. I don't know how familiar people are with landscape, but Church Street is quite an interesting ward. Well, I find it interesting in the sense that it's kind of sandwiched between some of the very wealthy areas, not only of the capital, but I think of the country. Yet in itself, it's quite a relative to those other areas, Westminster, it has quite a deprived community. It's very ethnically diverse, there's a big Middle Eastern population, and it has a large percentage of council housing and high levels of unemployment and child poverty. But there's also a lot of kind of local initiative to try and activate change in the neighbourhood, and that's something that we've been part of since we went there. And actually one of the reasons why we moved to that space was that there was a local forum of different stakeholders meeting up, and they heard about the showroom that was looking for a new home through Nicholas Logsdale of Listen Gallery, who's part of that network, and Terry Farrell, the architect, who has his offices in the area, got very enthusiastic about the idea of a contemporary art space being there. And actually there are no other contemporary art spaces apart from Listen Gallery in that part of London, or contemporary visual art spaces. So it was an interesting opportunity for us to go somewhere where we were wanted. And at the time, the East End felt very kind of, when the showroom was founded, it felt, it was very an important space for artists. And it was nestled within an area of London where there are a lot of artists living. And so in a way, it felt like quite a radical move to take the showroom out of that to an area where there aren't a lot of artists living, and to kind of find a new kind of, it continues with the same kind of mission, the same values, the same, same approach of being very centred on artistic production, but to also find other ways of making that kind of relevant within a local context. So I'll show you a few things. One of the things we did when we moved there, we got a grant from the Paul Hanlon Foundation to employ a staff member to be to be concentrated on the neighbourhood. And Louise Shelley has been in that role, who's one of my colleagues. She's a collaborative project curator. And so since 2010, we've been very much building up a lot of relationships within the neighbourhood with different kind of groups and residents. And I'm going to start with one project which we actually produced last year with an artist, Wendelin van Oldenburg, called From Left to Right. And so in a way this work comes at a kind of evolved stage of that local work, which I'll describe afterwards, but I'm just going to play a little excerpt from the film, just to give you a sense of what this. I'm just going to play it now. I can find it.
They feel me, they feel me, they feel me, they feel me. And there we see, they made up a story from all the fragments, and then I was charged, seen as charged. Now you feel me, you feel me, you feel me. And then you'll make up your story, and then I'll be what? Visible?
And there was no reaction. Like, there was no real reaction. There was punishment. There was no reform. There was no dialogue. There was just punishment. I think they say London's got the most CCTV in the world or something like that.
Growing up around here was like, I don't know, it was cool. But knowing that that building was there, you have to think twice about the things you do. It's kind of like puts fear into people, you know? People would always walk around there and be careful cutting through. Even if they wasn't doing any criminal activity, they'd just always be careful around it. Because it's the law.
It's already political. It is already political at the moment it activates.
I agree with that, but perhaps if I were to phrase it myself, I would maybe think of it slightly differently, and I would be like, it's a political act that happens within the self. So it's self-realization that is definitely a political act, but in itself it exists within the self, and to apply that outside of the self then is a different process. We can't just sing our way to a revolution. There might be music to inspire the revolution, or music that's a soundtrack to a revolution, but music on its own, I believe it's got a different power. It works on your emotions and it goes in a different place.
So if we are holding on to Freire's vision of political pedagogy, and which is one which is not authoritarian, which doesn't really mean that anyone has any answers for anything, etc. If we're holding on to it, so we may be able to also perhaps find ways of doing the political work different than what we did in the 80s and the 90s.
So this is just to give a bit of backstory to this film. It grows out of, as I said, long-term So we started to, through our local work, we started to meet young people through different sort of routes, through workshops, but also we met one local rapper through his mother, who's a photographer, who we've also worked with. She's an Iranian photographer who was photographing the revolution in Iran, and we did an exhibition with photographs of women's protests. And he came to a meeting with us, and we started to talk to him about the situation for young people in the neighbourhood, how there is quite a strong kind of gang culture that which is quite oppressive, and there are also other sort of tensions, particularly in relation to relationship between young people and policing of the area and various other things. And so we started working with Reveal, who's one of the rappers in the work, talking about how we could kind of forge a productive relationship between the showroom and some of those young people. Because there's a lot of musicians who are trying to get their work distributed in various ways online, but they didn't have the capacity to make good videos or access to the kind of skills and things that they needed for that. And so we started a video project where, with the other rapper who's called Owls, we made a film, and this came after he was convicted for being part of an dissident during the 2011 riots, and so he served a sentence for that. And he wrote a song while he was inside called Conspiracy, because he was convicted on the basis of CCTV footage. And he wasn't actually shown as doing anything against the law, illegal. He went, he was sentenced along with 16 others. And so we made this film, which was a 3-minute film with him. And before we did that, we also introduced Wendelin van Oldenburg, who's a Dutch artist, into that conversation. And Wendelin works in a way that's very much about producing a film through an event and through dialogue. So she sort of sets up the protagonists who come into conversation over an intensive film shoot. So this was 2 days. And basically, what interested me about this particular work and why I start with it was because it kind of was built on quite long-term work that gradually built up towards this moment. And also the work kind of continues on beyond this moment as well. And so, in a way, the thing that I'm interested in with the showroom and how we've developed the program since we came to this site is about how do you kind of build continuities and different kinds of relationships, and how can contemporary art projects have more than one outcome and resonate on different levels and work with different people. And so actually in this film there's a few different people involved. There's the two, well, I call them rappers, but apparently they say they're grime artists. I don't even know what that is. Reveal and Owls. Then there's Louise Shelley, who's our collaborative project creator. She's also in the film, in conversation. And there's a woman called Denise Ferreira da Silva, who you see talking a bit at the end. She's a Brazilian theorist, a political theorist. At the time she was a professor in ethics at Queen Mary University. And she's written a lot about riots and issues around race, particularly from a feminist perspective. Her texts are very dense and difficult. I find them hard to understand. But there was a sort of, I think what was interesting to me about this process was, I introduced Denise to Wendelin because I thought they would have something, they would have interests in common, and Wendelin introduced her into that conversation. And at the same time, Reveal, who's one of the musicians, is studying at SOAS ethnomusicology, and he's very interested in pedagogy and hip-hop pedagogy. And so there were productive conversations that could happen between him and Denise, who was an activist in Brazil in the 80s, who's very well versed in Paulo Freire, who's education theory, theories of the oppressed, of interest to Reveal. So we started to, in a way, take this conversation that we were having and to try and see how we could open that up and challenge it and see where it could go through this process of producing a film involving Wendelin, involving Denise. There's also Vanderlei Moreira, who's a Brazilian psychotherapist, who's also in the conversation. And so that film produced a kind of, in a way, the film doesn't have a linear narrative. It circles around a lot of things which are also to do with various sites in our neighbourhood. There's a music recording studio where a lot of bands, famous bands, recorded in the 80s, and part of the shoot, the two musicians brought songs which they wrote for the film, and they recorded them as part of the film, and they're in the film, but they're not excerpts of them, but they also, the songs have their own independent life from the film as well. And then there's a part that's filmed in a subway, and there's also a police station in the neighbourhood which has a very kind of ominous presence, which has a kind of detention unit for terror suspects, and that's part of it. So all these kind of components somehow are coming sort of into the foreground and receding as part of a kind of film that somehow takes in a way, the neighbourhood as a starting point and the kind of issues that are at stake there. And this is something which we've been trying to, in a way, work with since we've been in this neighbourhood, is to somehow read the contemporary through the neighbourhood and do that in a way that it's not about sort of making work about things, but it's about trying to raise contemporary issues through the programme, through artistic practices, through engaging artists or theorists, or working with various local groups that we've forged relationships with. So I shall go on. So this is a very early project, which I think was quite sort of, I think was also informed this approach quite strongly, which is with a young artist, Lawrence Abu-Hamdan, who was doing, well, he's just finishing his PhD actually at Goldsmiths at the Centre for Research Architecture, and he's been researching the kind of politics of contemporary politics of listening. And at this moment, we first invited him to just do workshops with this group of this neighbouring youth centre, whether a group of 14-year-old girls were a bit bored on Saturday afternoons, and they sort of were quite enthusiastically came forward to kind of enter into this project. So they did a series of 6 workshops over the subsequent weekends. And they were basically testing out the kind of relationship between sound and legal processes. So they did all these kind of different exercises around the courtroom, testing out things like the microphone, the role of the typist, the kind of how the law has to be enunciated and heard. And it sort of was interesting for him, I think, instead of, you know, conducting his research in the sort of within the walls of the university, it was an interesting moment for him to kind of take his research out and kind of test it out with a really different group of subjects. But after that, we actually decided to go on with him to support the research further, and he produced an audio essay called The Freedom of Speech Itself, where he started to look at the role of voice testing in immigration cases. And the showroom is situated in an area which has a high population immigrant community, and also around the corner from a legal migrants resource centre. And so he started to talk, for example, with the Migrants Resource Centre, but also his research was much broader, and he started to work with a Palestinian asylum seeker who had experienced this voice analysis in his case, and was told that he was not Palestinian, he was of another nationality, which was not the case. I can't remember if it's Syrian or from Jordan or something, but basically he got stuck in this kind of legal procedure because of a mistaken analysis of who he was. And so this is about a half-hour audio essay that kind of opens out that case. And so what I liked about this project was that it started with this group of girls, and it kind of involved different people in different ways, and it ended with this piece in the gallery. So another project which I was interested in the way that it kind of forged communities around the showroom was an exhibition we did with Cine Nova, which is a women's film distributor, who were founded, actually it was 2 women's film distributors merged in the early 90s, called Circles and Cinema of Women. And so it formed this collection, which is quite an amazing collection of women's film, but it's very difficult to access because Cine Nova still actually doesn't have any funding. It kind of relies a lot on, it relies completely on volunteer labour, and so the exhibition is called Reproductive Labour. But we brought together, in a way the showroom was part of a working group who had already come together around Cine Nova to try and kind of rescue it slightly. It was looking at the time very kind of precarious and vulnerable, and there were really questions about Cine Nova's future. But also Cine Nova was very difficult to access for anyone who wanted to see a film or understand what Cine Nova was. So we basically just brought the whole of Cine Nova to the showroom. Everything that it owned came, and we just set it up in the space, and we spent the period of the exhibition kind of working through Cine Nova's, the working group were very present and worked through all the kind of materials. We started to digitize it. We did a crowdfunding campaign to buy a computer so that the collection could start to be digitized. And I think for me this exhibition was really interesting in 2 ways, both in terms of what the space of an exhibition can be, how you can use it, because I think this project somehow traversed very different questions, both organisational questions and practical questions, question about sustainability of Cine Nova, but also about the politics of Cine Nova, the politics contained in the films, but also it produced a community around Cine Nova that was not visible. a lot of people turned up and spent time in the exhibition, and there were a lot of impromptu screenings and events, and it sort of had this amazing energy that sort of activated it. And I think, well, since then we've housed the digital collection, and so people can come and watch Cine Nova films and book in for sessions. And so another aspect of it that I also found interesting was the role, how one organisation can support another. So the showroom itself is not in a very stable position, but it's more stable than Cine Nova, and so we can sort of share, you know, we can lend our infrastructure to Cine Nova and see, you know, like we can kind of help strengthen another organisation through both giving Cine Nova, you know, like a place where people can come and access it, but also, and we have an ongoing series of film screenings now showing where we bring younger artists into dialogue with the Cine Nova archive. Speeding on, another concurrent project that we were doing alongside that was a film with Petra Bauer, who's a Swedish artist, who came to London on a one-year residency, which we were involved in setting up, and she was researching British filmmaking collectives, particularly from the kind of 70s, 80s kind of political filmmaking. And she was interested in the Cine Nova collection, so she did a lot of research in that collection and was interested in a way to take that further through making a film collectively. So we forged a relationship with Southall Black Sisters, which is an amazing women's organisation in Southall. I don't know how aware, if anyone's familiar with it, but they really, what was interesting for me was learning about Southall Black Sisters through this project, because it's, again, another small women's organisation. And the way they work is very grounded within their local community, which is Southall, which has a big South Asian communities, and very much looking at the position of women, both actively helping women in that community, and also translating that into ways in which they can lobby for those women and advocate for them on a political level. And they've been very successful. They've had laws changed. They're really amazingly articulate group of women, and the work also, I mean, they do very active campaigns. You can see this as some banners. I was going to show a clip from this film, but I think because the time is short, I might just go over it. But if anyone is interested in it, I can also give Vimeo passwords. So, but I think this film is it was basically filmed over 10 days, and it shows the labour of Southall Black Sisters. There's no voiceover, it's just looking at what they did in those 10 days, which includes a big event where a woman, Sue O'Sullivan, who founded Spare Rib magazine, gave a 70th birthday party for Southall Black Sisters. It was a huge event, and there's an amazing speech which I would have shown a clip of, but I'm not going to go over that, I'm afraid. We also, so over the last 4 years, we've been working a lot with a domestic workers union called Justice for Domestic Workers. And this was really initiated through a project we brought from the Netherlands. We work a lot in collaboration with a few different European organisations, one of which is Casco in Utrecht, where I actually used to work as the director for a few years. And they had a project called the Grand Domestic Revolution, and they started collaborating with a domestic workers union in the Netherlands. And when we brought that project to London, we started to forge a relationship with Justice for Domestic Workers, which is a very big union. I think they have about 400 or 500 members. It's women who are working in private homes, predominantly Southeast Asian women. We've involved them in probably now six projects or so, and we kind of see it as a very long-term relationship we're really keen to continue. And one of the projects that they were involved in was an exhibition by Kira Phillips, who's an artist who's based in Glasgow, and her work is very much centred on printmaking, screen printing. And Kira had done a few exhibitions where in the space of the exhibition she'd set up very informal kind of print workshops. She's amazing. She sort of comes with her screens, and she just can set up a workshop anywhere really. And so we're really keen to kind of foreground that aspect of her practice, of her being able to have this kind of very mobile practice, and that she's really keen to kind of open up her practice and share it. And we were also looking at the history of feminist print shops in London, which Kira was really interested to kind of research. And so in a way, part of the idea for the show was to see what you could activate through print. And so in the centre of the exhibition, she made an installation. In the centre was a kind of print workshop, which there were sort of a few different collaborations around that Kira invited a few artists and designers that she wanted to work with on an individual level to collaborate with. We also invited Justice for Domestic Workers, and we also invited a women's refuge, which we worked with also very regularly over the last years, called the Marybone Project. But in a way, the most dynamic collaboration was the one she had with Justice for Domestic Workers, and they met quite regularly over the course of the exhibition. And they started to work together on producing an alphabet, which is like this. And they started to make these kind of banners. This one, which they've used a lot in their campaigns. And the biggest campaign that they've been working on is about visa regulations and about questions about modern slavery. So at the moment, if a domestic worker comes to the UK, their visa is tied to their employer, which means that they can very easily get trapped into very difficult situations, and they can't leave. And so this is something that they're really very actively kind of campaigning about. And so this banner is supporting that campaign. But Kira got nominated for the Turner Prize for that show, which we are very pleased about. But I think what for me was really important about that project was how the work with the Domestic Workers Union came with that, or through that, into the tape. So you can see a couple of letters from that alphabet. And then there was sort of like different press around the show, but this article in the Evening Standard also for me I was quite proud of, because it really centres on that work with the Domestic Workers Union, and it starts to, in a way, like another story feeds through the show and into these more sort of prominent arenas. So the Showroom is a kind of very small organisation, we don't have a huge audience. But I think what's interesting is sometimes with these projects they kind of seep out into a wider public arenas, and that also happened a little bit with the project I showed with Lawrence Abu Hamdan, that he was also brought in to testify in court about voice analysis on the basis of his work. With the Justice Domestic Workers, their work was also, the campaign entered into Parliament, was discussed, and so you can sort of see, you follow these, you're following these cases, and feeding into them in a very small way, in a very modest way. I would never, make too big a claims about what we do. So I could just, this is a sort of big project that's sort of, in a way, a bit different, but to show another side of the work, a recent one, which I'll sketch through quickly, because I think it'd be nicer to have a discussion. So the Chimaranga is an organisation based in South Africa, in Cape Town. And actually one of our long-term collaborators at the Showroom has been the Uplift Group, with two artists, Angelica Saga and Koja Ashley, based in London. And when we had our reopening in 2009, they were the first show. And also they got nominated for the Turner Prize from that. But we continued with the Uplift Group, and we continued to collaborate with them to commission others. So this is the third exhibition we've done in collaboration with them. And there were some grants for collaboration with South Africa, so we seized upon the idea of bringing over Chimaranga, which is basically, difficult to see, but they have a number of outcomes that or regular things that they produce, one of which is The Chronic. It's a kind of newspaper that has a Pan-African perspective, and basically sort of focused on culture and politics, and both trying to look at African modernities and avant-gardes, as well as contemporary politics. And so we brought them, a lot of what they've been doing is kind of mapping, so they produce these different maps this was sort of concurrent to when we started talking with them. And this, in a way, the way in which we produced the exhibition, I'm just going to speed through, in a way was a kind of mapping of, we called it the Chimaranga Library, and they've done a few different projects in libraries where they kind of insert the Chimaranga kind of logic, superimpose it on top of the existing logic of the library. We didn't have the resources to do something like that, so we ended up trying to produce a library within the exhibition, which involved tapping into people in London who had kind of associations or affinities with the work of Chimaranga and the kind of research and knowledge that they're trying to produce. And we did two things. We had actually more than two things. You can see it's quite a full exhibition. There was a 5-day radio broadcast they have a radio station called the Pan-African Space Station. So for 5 days, we had these 45-minute slots from 2 till 8, and we invited all sorts of different people into conversation. And at the same time, we formed this library by borrowing books. Chimaranga sent us a list of 200 objects they needed, and we sourced them through just asking people. I mean, it was a kind of ambitious exhibition on a small budget, and so we had to rely on, in a way, our knowledge of people, our existing relationships. Those relationships produced other ones, and through that, somehow, it was an interesting way of grounding Chimaranga in London, sort of activating their work here through relationships. And so maybe I'm not going to go into depth about this, but just to show that somehow, I think what I'm trying to show through these particular projects in a way is how, let's say, the showroom starts to be formed. It's a lot about community building, and it's a lot about what you can do through relationships and how those can feed a program and build continuities, because various people we met through this were continuing to work with in other ways, and also with the other projects that I showed, that there's a kind of different threads that are running through our program that are very much based on that way of working, which is quite sort of centered around people, I guess, and knowledge and how you can activate those within the space. So, do you want me to talk about those networks, or should we just open it up? Alright, so yeah, then we've been one of the founding members of Common Practice, which is a London-based advocacy group of small organisations that got together fairly early on in my time at the showroom, when we all felt a bit, in a way, frustrated by the way in which there's a sort of no differentiation between the way in which work, let's say, cultural production is measured in the eyes of our funders. So we produced a paper called Size Matters, which was really to start to advocate for the work of the small-scale producer and to try and think about that work in a very expanded way. So we worked with a consultant called Sarah Thelwall, and we came up with this idea about deferred value and about how investing in the beginning of something, which is quite often what organisations like the Showroom do. We're commissioning, producing, we're often taking risks, but those things go on elsewhere, and so it's to try and to frame what we do within that perspective, that we're investing in the beginning of things that grow. Another network we're part of is Cluster. We've worked actually a lot with we had 2 European grants, and so through that we started to forge different, a couple of networks. This one is still, actually I'm afraid this map is a bit out of date because it's slightly changed. We're awaiting our next European grant application outcome. But this one is really a network of organisations that are based in off-centre, so that are based on the edges of cities or in the suburbs, that are working in residential areas. And we basically got a grant to visit each other, so over a period of 2 years we went and we looked at each other's work, and we didn't just look inside the organisations, we looked outside. We visited the neighbourhoods, we visited each other's local community centres, libraries, schools, and it was a really interesting experience to understand how that way of kind of working in a very situated way happens in other contexts. So this is something that we And I think that network also produced, you know, once you produce friendships through that are very important in terms of how you can take forward work. I mean, at the showroom, because we don't have a program budget, we're always having to look for different ways of producing things that often involve collaboration and exchange. And I think these networks not only are pragmatic, but they're also a very good source of exchange, dialogue, intellectual exchange. We produce publications through them. And so that's also, while I showed an example of work that's very grounded within a specific locality, there are things like the work also with Chimurenga, the work with these organisations which somehow, you know, like, finds a way to kind of build exchange around that it's not totally locked in a specific context, but can be, open that. This is a little book that we produced which also looks at that way of working within specific localities. But maybe there's any questions?
You have a chair out there. Okay.
Yeah.
But, has anybody got any questions for Emily? Well, perhaps I'll kick off. You've obviously touched on this, you know, and explained a bit about that through some of the projects, but what comes first? The desire to collaborate or fulfill a local need, or a particular artist that you want to work with? What drives?
There's no set pattern. No. I think quite often it's about recognising opportunities or recognising practices that might make sense, or, you know, like, I mean, it's in a way it's based on long-term kind of building up of knowledge. That, for example, Wendelin is an artist I've worked with before in the Netherlands. We didn't work together for quite a long time. We worked together in 2006, and then that work was last year. So there was a big period between those two productions, but it was about finding the right moment when her work would make sense and her methodology. And then, on the other hand, Chimurenga, the Otolith group would always say, oh, we really want to work with Chimurenga, and I could think, how on earth would we be able to work with Chimurenga? And then there were these grants for projects with South Africa, so we just seized the moment, we threw in our application, you know, and that opened up a huge, you know, that project could have been on different, many, you know, on other scales, but it sort of then, once we got the grant, we realised, oh, you know, like the potential of it suddenly seemed very big, and originally I thought, oh, maybe it's a smaller project in the summer, and then we shifted it to the autumn, and we made it really like, if we're going to do this, we really will do it. And so projects grow, you know, like sometimes you start quite small, like what I showed, in a way that's why I showed that example with Lawrence at Abu Hamdan, that it started with a few workshops, and I went to them, and I really thought they were amazing, the way he worked with those young people, and the dynamic that was there. There was this real energy. And it's the same with the Domestic Workers Union. You go to a meeting with them, you feel this like amazing energy, and you think, you know, in a way it's about how can you do something with that. So in a way it's quite intuitive, the work, and you know, it is about being able to recognise what makes sense at a particular moment, and you know, I mean, I'm showing a fragment because there's also, we do make projects with artists when it's also about recognising the right moment for an artist to, you know, do something ambitious, and for us to support that, because one of the things that I think now that we've built up a lot of networks, for example, with the European spaces, we can quite often find ways to produce things that are with artists that are more ambitious than things they might have done before, and to feed those out to other partners, and you know, there's a kind of, yeah.
And when you identify that perhaps a moment has come to pass, or that, you know, there's a right point in time, do you work with artists who are new to collaboration? Or
Yeah, I mean,
are you basing your
we're quite careful because in a way one of the important things is that we hold the relationships with a lot of groups that we work with. So Louise is very careful, and she's the one that's really working, getting to know these different people in groups and having those early conversations with them and then mediating between them and an artist. And so sometimes, we have invited in artists who haven't worked in that way, and then we make sure that we kind of have somebody else present. So it's, in a way, it's sort of finding the right kind of fit between what an artist might want to do, what we think, or a conversation with a group, and in a way, so there's never, and quite often it is about starting something small and seeing where it goes, and if there's something that makes sense to take forward, then do. I mean, with that kind of side of the programme, it's slightly different in the sense that we always fundraise in advance for that programme, so that we've had money, like funding from different trusts and foundations, and that gives a kind of flexibility that you can try things out through it. Whereas, for example, if we would ask an artist to do an exhibition, then you're kind of committing to something quite big, straight, from the outset. And then you have to fundraise for that project, because usually you start with nothing and find the ways to produce things. So things go. It's quite different ways of working that we work with. So there's no set format.
Yes, questions?
No, so this is quite a technocratic question. What kind of institutional structures allow that level of flexibility and that level of responsiveness?
Yeah, well, we've created it. In a way, there's lots of. It looks very flexible, but in a funny way, we don't have a lot of resources. The showroom, so artists also have to be very patient with us, and we are also patient with them. So there's a kind of, I think, when an artist comes to work with us, we're very clear about what they're entering into, because in a way it's very shared, it's very collaborative, and usually we're sort of, wanting to produce something together. And I mean, with the projects that I showed, there's a very high level of collaboration from us, but some projects don't have that. We don't have them. We're only 5 people at Showroom. None of us are actually full-time. But in terms of flexibility, that is about, I think that's something I've really tried to work, to develop, is that possibility to allow things to grow and to be realised at their own pace, to enable the potential of something. So we have actually shifted things in time sometimes, and then you've got to, be very kind of quick at figuring out a solution to what's going to fill that gap, or But we're working on different scales all the time. So, for example, quite often in the summer we'll use the space as a more loose kind of workshop orientated approach. Whereas in the autumn we tend to try and have something that's one of the bigger scale productions. Sometimes, you have to be basically on your feet the whole time and kind of figuring out solutions to how you can work like that. But I think, for me, the best results have come out of doing that, and I think quite often projects really go beyond your expectations. Sometimes they don't, but but generally, like the ones I showed, which of course are the ones that did, are the ones where you sort of, like something happens through allowing it, like through not trying to sort of keep it too rigid. But there's high level, in a few of those, there's been high levels of risk in terms of, I always use this as an example, but the Petra Bauer's film, Sisters, we confirmed the funding 2 weeks before the shoot. And it was just so stressful because, both for her and for us, that we were talking about either it would be a 2-day or a 10-day shoot, and the result, the outcome would have been an enormous difference to what you can do in 2 days and 10 days. But we had to retain that flexibility and also that ambition that we didn't want to close it down, lock it down for a 2-day shoot, when there was still a possibility that we could do the 10-day shoot. And with Wendeleen's film also, we would, we weren't even sure in the week of the film, would the guys turn up? Because they had, they were cautious about entering into that frame, and I think that was important as well, that they were. And so, and also, with Chimaranga, they gave us this whole list of different things, and it's so, we were working to the last minute of, trying to find these things. Things emerged in the course, during the exhibition, people would bring things, and there's a sort of, I think that, to me, I find that, I like that way of working, that you keep something open, and you try your hardest to kind of, I don't know, keep those possibilities open. But it is, it is a kind of, it's not the easiest way of working,
Yes.
When you're looking for funding for that way of working, that's it's pretty much part of the way that we like to work as an organisation too. And there's so many knockbacks because people want something that's much more defined. They don't get that process. So I wonder if there's, in terms of you securing funding from trusts and what have you, what strategies do you use to put that across to people?
Yeah, well, it always depends on the project. I mean, it was really hard to get the Southall Black Sisters film made. And then it was interesting because Bloomberg came in at the last minute, because they work with Southall Black Sisters as well, and they liked the idea of, two arms of their philanthropy connecting. And they really rescued it. I really was so kind of impressed in a way by the way they just stepped in at the last minute. And even actually the film that we just produced with Lebanese artist Rana Hamadeh, we were still fundraising a week before the show opened, and some people, individual supporters, stepped in because they're Middle Eastern and they wanted to support a young Middle Eastern artist. But again, it was sort of like, you're sort of still working on the... So in a way, it's about not giving up. But in terms of persuasive arguments, I mean, I think with the work we're doing with this program, Communal Knowledge, which is the neighbourhood program, it is very much about I mean, I think that's been a hard program to fund as well, because we're very we're not wanting to kind of instrumentalise, and we're not wanting to it's very we've achieved a lot through that program, but it's very difficult to measure, and also we're it's not like we've got great, huge figures for the amount of people we've reached through that program, and sometimes we're working with the same people, But it's in a way I see it as we're developing kind of methodologies that we're testing through that program, and it's kind of forging a model. And I think the ones who, especially the Paul Hanlon Foundation, really understood that. And so I've really impressed by the way in which they, there are certain trusting foundations who can understand that you have to work in quite a speculative way and test things out, and that's, productive. And I think, the approach has been influential because we get asked to talk about it the whole time, and I do think it's about having a very, whenever we start a project, we start with a very broad kind of idea about where we can go, and we're very strategic, and we're also quite often, I think there's an interesting complexity behind these projects which you end up talking in this part of the talk, so it's good to have time at the end, which is the sort of back end of the plugs and, things that I mean, the sort of complexity behind a project, I think, is really interesting because often you're forging, not only through the project, you're forging connections between very different, you know, people that wouldn't come into contact, but you're doing that behind the scenes in terms of the way in which you're resourcing, you know, sourcing funding for different things. And so I think the showroom, since we moved to this space, we massively increased our overheads, and it was at a time when we were literally signing the lease at the time just after the kind of credit crunch, and you know, it just felt so crazy when, you know, we had these nervous board meetings where we're like, what are we doing? And but it was, I think, to be bold and stand out and you know, like, not compromise and go for something that somehow, I think, wins people over, to be confident and to make bold moves, to be ambitious. But through that we had to really diversify the funding sources, because before the showroom was kind of able to, a high percentage of the overheads were covered from the Arts Council grant, and then there were project funding and things like that. But now we have to really raise a lot of money just for the overheads as well as the programme. And so that has, like, we've had these European grants, and we've had the trusts and foundations, we do hire out the building, we have project grants, individual, you know, it's really quite diverse, but I think it gives more stability, even though it means that we're sort of very stretched, you know, like, and you'll sort of find that you're having very different conversations, but I think that is the way, I think, that I found that you can sort of make things happen. But yeah, I wish I could give you some tips for convincing convincing argument, but I think it's usually about, ideas.
Some people are very bold and they just state what they're going to do and then they do something completely.
Yeah, no, well, that is also true. That's
which is another way to do it.
I find that quite often you have to articulate a project the first time when you're, which I'm sure you do as well when you're doing the fundraising. And that it actually you know, that's part of the process, and so, you know, you have to start working things out at that point, but of course they can also change in the process.
I'm really interested in your staff member who's dedicated to developing those neighbourhood relationships. I don't know if that was the Louise.
Louise, yeah, she's amazing.
And I think you can talk a little bit about what
The
she
role.
does.
Yeah, so we fundraised for that post with Paul Hamlin, and then we've had other supporters for that. And basically, I give her a very free. Yeah, she's sort of developed it herself, and there are certain things which, when we came to the neighbourhood, there were sort of things in place, like there's a networking lunch for different organisations in the neighbourhood every month, and we quite often host it. There's a man in our neighbourhood who we call the Walker Talker of Church Street. He's known as that. He's a big Glaswegian guy called John, and he knows everybody in the neighbourhood. And so quite often we'll send artists off on a walk with John when they come to the showroom, and he'll bring people to the showroom. We'll ask him if we need to, you know. And so there are already these things, structures in the neighbourhood that we tapped into very early on, actually before Louise arrived, because she came at a slightly later stage. But she's very resourceful at basically just being aware of who's about and meeting people, and she continues to build that. So, for example, she just met the other day with an organisation which is dedicated to young men, you know, to try and work with young men to kind of deal with some of the issues that are, like I explained with that piece that I first showed. So we're going to work with them in taking forward some of the relationships that came through that work, including Reveal and his hip-hop pedagogy idea. And so she works in a very fluid way. It's quite unstructured in a sense, but she's also managing a lot of different workshops. And so we also got a grant for working with young people, and so she's very active in terms of working with schools. And she programs events, and yeah, it's quite quite, in a way, yeah, it's quite unstructured, I would say, but it works. So that's, I think it needs to be like that in order to work. And I think people really like her in the neighbourhood, and like there's people that drop by all the time to see her. She gets someone delivering her newspapers every Monday morning, and you know, there's a sort of, I think it is about sort of building, you know, familiarity and being approachable, that I think has been very successful in the way that she's developed that programme. No, I actually, well, we put out, I mean, we had someone else in that role before her, but that person left fairly early on, so then we recruited Louise. And it was interesting because she's not from an education background or gallery education background. She's working in the CCA in Glasgow. She was up against candidates who were from that background, and so it was, I remember being quite a dilemma about who to take, and then she had a second interview, and I suddenly realised she's the right person.
Any other questions or anything?
Could I ask you about Cluster, the very interesting international network? Can you tell us anything about the kind of things that you've learned from that involvement, and the kind of things that your fellow members have learned from Showroom?
Yeah, good question. I think it was interesting the visits that we looked in the neighbourhoods, and I think to me that made me really think about organisations and what they are, in the sense that, you know, like we had a kind of quite expanded idea of, I mean, we learned different things at different places as well. For example, at Tensta Konsthall, it's an art centre situated in a suburb of Stockholm called Tensta, and there we went to, it has an interesting like local infrastructure, you know, community-based activities. And we went around all those, we went to a women's house, went to the library, schools, and Tensta is interesting because they have a cafe, and their space is situated under a shopping centre. It's actually in the storage unit of the shopping centre, a former storage, and it's right next to the station. It's quite central. It's very planned, like heavily planned suburb, modernist kind of planned suburb. But they have a cafe, and the cafe is run by local people. And it was interesting to me. This is the thing the Showroom lacks in a way, which we wouldn't have the possibility for. They use that cafe to mediate between the Konsthall and the neighbourhood. And they have a local woman on the front desk as well. And there was really an interesting way in which they were trying to integrate their work into the neighbourhood. But it was interesting because I think Marie Lind runs Tensta Konsthall, and she'd come to the Showroom a few times before she started developing it. And I think she'd be influenced by some of the things we were doing. So there's a kind of way in which these, you know, once you start looking at the detail of what each other does, and also in terms of the staffing structures, who they have doing what, and just the way in which they're relating to their local settings. It's very kind of, this work is very kind of nuanced and detailed, I think, and so to go and look at those details, giving it time, and not just rushing in and seeing a show. You know, in fact, we spent less time on the shows and, you know, the thing, you know, more time on what are the, you know, like how we set up, how we kind of relating to our surroundings. Also we went to Halom, which is a really interesting arts organisation called the Israeli Centre for Digital Arts. And they have been running a programme which is quite politicised. They ran a project called Liminal Spaces, which was collaborating with Palestinian organisations that was a while back, but they're in a neighbourhood called Jesse Cohen, which is an immigrant neighbourhood with a quite strong kind of Ethiopian and Russian immigrant populations, which is also very kind of run down and deprived neighbourhood. And they also went to their community centre and youth club. There was an interesting thing that there's a big road that's built through their neighbourhood, and it's the same with the Showroom's neighbourhood. The Showroom, the Westway a massive kind of spatial intervention that produced some of the kind of, I mean, this is something I didn't mention, but when we first arrived, our landlords, Farrells, had done a lot of spatial analysis about why this neighbourhood was like it is. And some of the contributing factors were things like the massive flyover. It cuts Church Street from the other side, and also big train lines. And actually, when we went to Jesse Cohen, they have the same like big road that cuts completely between the two areas of the. And so there are interesting kind of spatial factors. The way Tenster also, you know, cut off from the city, and you know that you start to understand. And also Daubervilliers in Paris, the Daubervilliers is in a very ethnically diverse, dense kind of local population, looking at also the spatial factors of where they are in Paris, and you know, like the diversity in terms of languages spoken, you know, that these, it was really interesting, I think, to really think about where you are and how, you know, how you have a responsibility towards, towards, you know, like situating your work in that context, and then how can you exchange between there and elsewhere so that you don't remain too sort of isolated. Also, Bretigny was interesting. CAC Bretigny, they work in a suburb of Paris, and they started working in a way that every project kind of has a legacy. So in the building, you find legacies of lots of different things that they've done. So it was also kind of learning about practice and how you can think about these continuities that I was talking about, and legacies, that you don't see a program as being just about moving things in and out of a building, but you see them as being kind of having these possibilities to integrate into your organisation and have an impact in different ways that we learned from there. So I think each place taught a different thing, and actually we've changed the network. If we get this next grant, which I'm not sure we will because it's very last minute and highly ambitious, but we added in, so there's transit now in Budapest, there's an organisation called Inland from Madrid, which is an artist-run organisation that's focused on rural, like working in rural areas. But I think what was interesting about this network was also about what does it mean to work on the periphery. And actually, the showroom is in very central London, so it was slightly, you know, but there are characteristics from the showroom's neighbourhood which you could see in the suburb of Tenster, in the suburbs of, you know, Bretigny, that made me understand. But I think it was very much about working outside of the centre, and that's not just about where you are geographically, but actually where you position your work and who you align with. And to think on them, like, in a way, to think about working on the margins, or, you know, like, and what does that mean, and what can you produce through that? That to me, those are the kind of important things that kind of raised, was also, we don't want to be in the centre, there's this fertile ground that's outside of the centre, which is, you know, and actually to also be like, all of these organisations are not like the sort of national this and that, they're the kind of small art centre on the edge that's doing something that's not having that kind of big spotlight, but that enables a certain kind of other possibilities that you can't do if you're, you know, in the centre of Paris or Madrid, or, you know.
Are all the centres on the network in big cities, or are
Most of them. I mean, the only one is in Utrecht. Casco, where I used to work, is, in a way, Casco is in a small, Utrecht is one of the bigger, the fourth biggest city in the Netherlands, but, you know, it's quite a small city. But in a way, that's peripheral to Amsterdam, because Netherlands is also quite, although there's sort of strong regional distribution, it's also, you know, like, it's sort of off-centre, let's say. It's an effort to get to Casco, you know, this, there's not a big sort of community of arts community in Utrecht. It's always, you know, the showroom, although it's in central London, it's sort of effort for a lot of people to get to. Bretigny is a big effort, you know, and so that does produce something within the, you know, like the kind of audiences you get, and the way, your way of thinking about the work. I mean, when I worked in Utrecht, I arrived, there was no audience. And I was, you know, arrived, no knowledge, no network, nothing, and thinking, how can I activate this space? And so we decided to just build the audience into the production each time, you know, to work in a way. That's where this kind of work that I showed sort of came from, is to not rely on the outside, you know, in a passive kind of way, but to see that you can generate something, you know, to work in a kind of generative way that involves people, that to me has, you know, in a way came from that moment of not wanting to sit around waiting for an audience to come, you know.
We've all been there.
It's too painful.
I think you're going to join us for, for lunch, aren't you? And lunch is ready, so I think we'll conclude this part of the event. And thank everybody else so much for